The wine from those vines had been on the altar of every Catholic church in 3 states since 1911. Margaret poisoned them because she thought I was running a bar operation. She was so proud of it she announced it at the HOA meeting. 19 days later, a cardinal flew in from Rome, and he did not come to forgive her. It started with a zoning complaint. Margaret Chenoweth didn't like the sound of hymns at sunset. She didn't like the delivery trucks on Sunday mornings. Most of all, she didn't like that a small Catholic parish on Hickory Lane was fermenting wine behind the rectory. So she did what any self-appointed guardian of property values would do. She decided to shut it down. What happened next would draw the attention of the Holy See, force a canonical trial, and prove that some battles have consequences far beyond a neighborhood dispute. St. Michael's Parish had been pressing wine on Hickory Lane since before anyone in Ridgeline Estates was born. The original vines were planted in 1911 by Father Francis Lombardi, an Italian immigrant who arrived with 2 cassocks, a Latin missal, and a single suitcase full of rootstock from his family's vineyard outside Naples. He planted 600 vines on the south-facing slope behind the rectory. By 1920, every Catholic parish within 200 miles was using St. Michael's altar wine. The soil there is limestone and clay, the same mineral profile you'd find in Tuscany. Father Francis knew that. He'd spent his childhood walking those Tuscan hills. When he dug his hands into that Colorado dirt, he recognized it instantly. The vineyard grew. By 1950, it was supplying wine to over 300 churches across 3 states. By 1980, the diocese had certified it as a sacred wine operation, exempt from standard zoning because it wasn't commercial. There were no labels, no bottles for sale, no tasting room, just a small fermentation cellar beneath the church, a 100-year-old press, and a careful process that produced roughly 800 gallons per year, all of it consecrated on altars from Denver to Cheyenne. Then Margaret Chenoweth bought the lot directly across the street. She moved into Ridgeline Estates in October of 2022. Retired corporate attorney, divorced, with a degree from Harvard Law and a personality that could curdle milk at 20 paces. She'd paid $1.2 million for a 4-bedroom Mediterranean that was 50 feet from the parish property line. Within 2 weeks of moving in, she'd filed 3 separate complaints with the HOA. Noise from evening mass headlights shining into her bedroom. Delivery trucks idling on Sunday mornings while the priests unloaded supplies. But it was the fermentation shed that really enraged her. She told neighbors it smelled like a bar. She told the HOA board it was an unlicensed commercial winery operating in a residential zone. She hired an environmental consultant who claimed the yeast and sulfites were lowering her property value, though the consultant's report, when I finally saw it, was 3 pages of speculation held together with corporate letterhead and wishful thinking. I'm Father Thomas Avalone. I've been the pastor at St. Michael's for 14 years. I'm 72 years old. I learned to prune vines from the parishioner who'd learned from Father Francis himself. The vineyard is my daily prayer. Every morning, I walk those rows before sunrise, touching the leaves, checking the grapes. I know every vine. Number 42 has always been a little stubborn. Number 18 produces clusters so sweet the bees mob it in August. In the winter, when the branches go bare and the snow piles up against the stone wall, you can still feel the life underground waiting. Margaret never understood that. She never set foot on the property. She never asked a single question. She just wanted it gone. She told the HOA board that if they didn't enforce the covenants, she'd sue them personally. She was a lawyer. They were terrified, so they issued a violation notice. I received its certified mail, the return address belonging to a woman I'd never met. The letter accused St. Michael's of operating a quote-unquote alcohol production facility without proper permits in violation of HOA Rule 7.14. It gave us 30 days to cease all winemaking activities or face fines starting at $200 per day. I called the diocese. They sent a canon lawyer who explained that the HOA's authority stopped at the property line. Church was a separate legal entity. The vineyard was pre-existing, documented, and protected under religious land use statutes. Margaret didn't care. She hired a firm out of Denver that specialized in neighborhood litigation. They filed a nuisance complaint in county court, alleging that the yeast spores from fermentation were migrating across the road and causing her respiratory distress. It was absurd. But absurdity, when it's backed by enough money, can still cost you thousands in legal fees. The diocese started talking about selling the vineyard land to cover the costs. Parishioners wept. I lay awake at night staring at the ceiling, praying for clarity. And then, on a Thursday evening in late July, Margaret Chenoweth walked into the monthly HOA meeting at the Ridgeline Clubhouse and took the microphone during the public comment period. What she said next would end her. She just didn't know it yet. She stood at the podium in a white linen blazer, gold bracelets clinking softly as she adjusted the microphone. The room held about 40 people, mostly retirees, a few young couples, the HOA board seated at a folding table up front. Margaret smiled. It wasn't a nervous smile. It was the smile of someone who had delivered bad news to opposing counsel for 30 years and still got a thrill from it. I wanted to update everyone on the situation with the so-called vineyard across the street, she began. As many of you know, I've been fighting to enforce our community standards against what is essentially a commercial alcohol operation masquerading as a church activity. She paused, waiting for nods. A few came. Well, I'm happy to report that the problem has been resolved, permanently. I wasn't at that meeting. I was in the rectory, reading evening prayers. But 3 parishioners who were there told me what happened next. Margaret pulled a small glass vial from her purse and held it up. Empty. This morning I applied a concentrated herbicide to the root systems of every single vine on that property. By next week, they'll all be dead. No more wine, no more smell, no more delivery trucks. You're welcome. The room went silent. The HOA president, a retired dentist named Arthur Pendleton, later said his first thought was that she was joking. His second thought was that he'd just witnessed a confession to a crime that would destroy everything he'd spent 10 years building in that community. Someone asked if she was serious. Margaret laughed. Deadly serious. I used imazapine, a soil sterilant. Those vines won't come back for 50 years. And before anyone gets righteous, I consulted with my attorney. It's my property line. I was within my rights to apply herbicide to plants encroaching on my lot. She put the vial back in her purse. If they want to make wine, they can buy grapes from a store like everyone else. The meeting broke up 10 minutes later. Nobody called the police. Nobody called me. They were all still processing what they'd heard. The next morning, I walked out to the vineyard at dawn as I'd done for 14 years. The air smelled wrong, chemical sharp. At first, I thought it was pesticide from a neighbor's lawn. Then I saw the leaves. The edges were curling, turning brown, not just on one vine, on all of them. 600 vines, some of them 112 years old, all showing the same pattern of necrosis. I knelt beside vine number 18, the one that always produced the sweetest clusters. The soil at its base was damp with something that wasn't water. It had a faint yellow tint and smelled like a chemistry lab. I touched it, and my fingers tingled. Imazapine. I didn't know the name yet, but I knew it was poison. I called the groundskeeper, Manuel Herrera, who'd worked the vineyard for 43 years. He arrived within 15 minutes, took one look at the leaves and crossed himself. "Father," he said, his voice breaking, "this is not disease. Someone has killed them." We spent the next 2 hours walking every row. The damage was systematic. Each vine had been treated at the base. Footprints in the soft dirt, small, a woman's shoes, size 7 maybe, led from vine to vine. They came from the direction of Margaret's property. They returned the same way. I called the police. A patrol officer arrived, young guy, looked at the vines, took a report. He said it was probably vandalism, maybe kids. I told him about the footprints, the chemical smell, the fact that someone would need knowledge of herbicides to do this. He nodded, said a detective would follow up. Nobody followed up. What I didn't know, what I wouldn't learn for 3 days, was that Margaret had announced exactly what she'd done to 40 witnesses. It wasn't until Arthur Pendleton called me, his voice shaking, that I understood. He'd been unable to sleep since the meeting. He said he needed to tell me something in person. Arthur arrived at the rectory that evening with his wife. He looked like a man who'd aged 10 years in 72 hours. He sat at my kitchen table, refused coffee, and told me everything. The podium, the vial, the laughter. By the time he finished, I was gripping the table so hard my knuckles were white. "Father, I should have called you immediately. I was afraid. She threatened to sue anyone who reported her. She said she'd ruin us financially. I forgave him because that's what priests do, but I also told him he'd need to make a statement. He agreed. That night, I called the diocese. Bishop Raphael Campos took my call at 10 p.m. He listened without interrupting, which was unusual for him. When I finished, there was a long silence. Then he said something I will never forget. "Father Thomas, this is not a crime against your parish. This is a sacrilege. Those vines produced wine that became the blood of Christ on 1,000 altars. Someone who deliberately destroys what is set aside for the Eucharist does not merely vandalize property, they profane something holy." The bishop asked for a written report, photographs, soil samples, witness statements. He forwarded everything to the Apostolic Nuncio in Washington the next morning. The Nuncio's office, which is the Vatican's embassy, sent it to the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith in Rome. Things moved faster than I expected. By Friday, 4 days after Margaret's announcement, a Monsignor from the Nunciature called Bishop Campos directly to confirm that the Holy See was taking an interest. Now you have to understand something about canon law. The Catholic Church has its own legal system, with courts, judges, and penalties. Most people think excommunication is a relic of the Middle Ages, but it's still very real. It's the most severe penalty the Church can impose. It means you are cut off from the sacraments, from the community of the faithful, from the Church itself. It is reserved for the gravest offenses: heresy, schism, desecration of the Eucharist, physical violence against the Pope. For someone to be excommunicated for destroying a vineyard, there was no precedent. But the vines of St. Michael's were not just any vineyard. They had been blessed by a bishop in 1912, consecrated for the singular purpose of producing sacramental wine. The wine from those grapes had been on the altar during the consecration at every Mass in 3 states. According to the Church's own theology, that wine becomes the literal blood of Christ. To poison those vines, knowing what they produced, was interpreted as an intentional act of desecration. It wasn't just vandalism. It was an attack on the Eucharist itself. Bishop Campos flew to Rome on August 2nd to present the case directly to the congregation. He brought the soil samples, the photos of the dying vines, and a sworn affidavit from Arthur Pendleton. He also brought something else, a clip from the HOA meeting that someone had recorded on their phone. Margaret's voice, clear and proud, describing exactly what she'd done. The congregation deliberated for 9 days. I stayed in Colorado, tending to the dying vines even though I knew it was hopeless. Manuel and I watered them, prayed over them, tried to flush the soil. Nothing worked. One by one, the leaves turned black and fell. The grapes shriveled on the stems. By August 12th, the vineyard that had stood for over a century was dead. And then came the news. The congregation had issued a rare lati sententiae declaration, a finding that Margaret Chenoweth had incurred automatic excommunication by her actions. But they went further. They wanted it to be public, formal, undeniable. They wanted the world to understand that what she'd done was not just illegal, but a mortal offense against the faith. So they dispatched a cardinal. Cardinal Giancarlo Rossini was the prefect of the Apostolic Signature, the highest judicial authority in the Church after the Pope himself. He had handled cases involving bishops, governments, international tribunals. He had not, in his 40-year career, ever been sent to a small parish in Colorado to deal with an HOA dispute. But on August 15th, the Feast of the Assumption, he stepped off a plane at Denver International Airport with a leather briefcase containing the formal decree of excommunication, signed and sealed. I was informed by the diocese that he would arrive at St. Michael's the following morning. There would be a ceremony. The excommunication would be pronounced publicly in the church, with the doors open. Margaret would be invited to attend, though everyone knew she wouldn't come. The gesture wasn't for her. It was for the record. It was for the church, for the faithful, for the 1,000 altars that would never again taste wine from those vines. The ceremony was held at 10 a.m. on August 16th. Every pew was full. The choir sang the Kyrie. Cardinal Rossini, in full scarlet robes, walked the center aisle carrying the decree like a death sentence. He was a tall man, silver-haired, with the face of someone who had spent decades navigating Vatican politics and found Colorado mosquitoes a refreshing change. He stood before the altar and read the declaration in Latin first, then English. Margaret Chenoweth, through her deliberate and knowing act of destroying vines consecrated for the production of sacramental wine, has incurred automatic excommunication. By this public decree, the Church formally acknowledges her separation from the communion of the faithful. I watched from the front pew. Beside me, Manuel wept. Margaret did not attend. Instead, she stood on the public sidewalk outside the parish gates, holding a sign that read "Religious Bullies" and live streaming to her 1,500 Facebook followers. Her attorney had already prepared a defamation lawsuit against the diocese, naming me, the bishop, and Cardinal Rossini personally. The suit demanded $7.5 million in damages for infliction of emotional distress, invasion of privacy, and interference with her property rights. The legal theory was novel. Margaret argued that the excommunication constituted a public shamming that had destroyed her reputation and made her a target of harassment. Within 48 hours, the story had gone national. CNN ran a segment titled "Vineyard Vigilante or Religious Victim." A legal analyst on Fox News called it the most ridiculous case he'd ever seen, then spent 8 minutes debating it anyway. Margaret had become a cause célèbre for anti-religious activists. She gave an interview to a national newspaper in which she described herself as a Satanist, a revelation that caused her own attorney to resign the following morning. His replacement, a media-savvy litigator from Los Angeles named Julian Cross, immediately reframed the case as a First Amendment battle. His client, he argued, had merely exercised her right to apply legal herbicide to her own property. The Church's response, he said, was a medieval punishment designed to silence her. The case landed in federal court. That was when things got worse, much worse. During discovery, my attorney subpoenaed Margaret's purchase records. We found that the herbicide she used was imazapine, a soil sterilant that is restricted in Colorado for agricultural use without a state permit. Margaret did not have a permit. She had ordered it online from a chemical supplier in Alabama using a fake business name, Chenoweth Landscape Solutions, which was not a registered LLC. Shipping a restricted-use pesticide across state lines without proper labeling is a federal offense under FIFRA, the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act. The Environmental Protection Agency opened an investigation. The FBI, because the shipment crossed state lines, opened another. Suddenly, Margaret was facing federal criminal charges. The maximum penalty was 5 years in prison and $100,000 in fines per count. She had applied the chemical to 600 individual vines, so the U.S. Attorney's Office initially considered 600 counts. They eventually settled on 10, but that was still more than enough to derail her civil lawsuit. Here is where the story pivots. I wish I could tell you that the federal investigation brought the case to a swift conclusion. It did not. Instead, it uncovered something even darker. During the EPA's soil testing, investigators found that the imazapine had not stayed on the parish property. It had leached into the groundwater, migrating downhill into the aquifer that supplied drinking water to the entire Ridgeline Estates community. 14 private wells were contaminated. The HOA had to issue a no-drink order. Bottled water was trucked in. Families with young children were evacuated. The very people Margaret had claimed to be protecting were now suffering because of her actions. The HOA president, Arthur Pendleton, called me in tears. "She poisoned our water, Father. She poisoned us all." The community turned on Margaret overnight. Her house was vandalized, her Range Rover spray-painted with the word "murderer," though no one had died. The HOA filed its own lawsuit, seeking damages for remediation costs estimated at $2.3 million. Her homeowner's insurance declined to cover the claim, citing intentional acts. Her mortgage lender initiated foreclosure proceedings when she stopped making payments. Her life was collapsing, and yet she refused to back down. In a court filing, she accused the church of engineering the groundwater contamination to frame her, a claim so baseless that the judge ordered it stricken from the record and sanctioned her attorney $5,000 for filing frivolous pleadings. And then came the evidence that changed everything. A parishioner named Elena Vasquez, 78 years old, had been walking the vineyard with Father Francis when she was a child. She remembered him telling her about the vines, how they were more than plants, they were relics. She came to my rectory one evening with a dusty box. Inside was a leather-bound journal kept by Father Francis from 1911 to 1947. In its pages, I found a letter from the Apostolic Delegate to the United States, dated June 12, 1912, less than a year after the first vines were planted. The letter stated, in formal ecclesiastical Latin, that the Vineyard of St. Michael's was declared a sacred patrimony of the Church, its fruits set apart for the holy sacrifice in perpetuity. Destroying it was not merely vandalism, the letter explained. It was an act of desecration that carried the penalty of excommunication reserved to the Holy See. Margaret hadn't just poisoned a vineyard. She had violated a papal decree that predated her birth by 7 decades. The Vatican had not overreacted. They had followed a specific century-old protocol. Elena's journal made international headlines. The Pope himself referenced the case during his Wednesday audience, calling the vines martyrs and asking for prayers for the parish. That was the moment Margaret's last hope of public sympathy evaporated. But there's one more twist, and this is the part that still keeps me awake at night. The soil tests revealed not only a mazapa. They found traces of a second chemical, one that had not been sold commercially since 1985. Chlordine. It was a banned termiticide, so toxic that the EPA had phased it out decades ago. It was old, possibly applied on Margaret's property long before she bought it, and the amazapa had somehow reactivated its mobility in the soil. The combination had created a toxic plume far more dangerous than anyone initially understood. The remediation cost estimate jumped to $11 million. Margaret's little act of spite had become one of the most expensive residential contamination cases in Colorado history. And now, the EPA wanted to know, had she known about the old chlordine, had she deliberately used the amazapa to mask it, or had she simply been an unwitting trigger? The investigation was no longer just about a dead vineyard. It was about whether Margaret Chenoweth had committed an environmental crime of staggering proportions, or whether she was the unluckiest woman alive. The answer, when it came, would shatter everything. The EPA's final report was delivered to my rectory on a Tuesday morning in March, thick as a phone book, stamped confidential in red ink. By then, the Ridgeline Estates wells had been offline for 7 months. Families were still living in rented apartments, their mortgages frozen, their lives suspended. I read the report in one sitting, my hands trembling not from age, but from the sheer weight of what it contained. The chlordine had been in the soil since 1962, when the land Margaret's house stood on was still an apple orchard. The orchard owner, a man named Harold Bixby, had used it legally before the ban to control subterranean termites that were killing his trees. The chemical had been inert for 40 years, bound tightly to clay particles deep underground, harmless. Nobody knew it was there. The developer who built Ridgeline Estates had never tested for legacy pesticides because the law didn't require it. The county had signed off. Margaret bought a ticking time bomb she couldn't see, and her amazapa, a powerful chelating agent, had unbound the chlordine molecules, pulling them into the water table like a syringe drawing poison from a wound she didn't know existed. So Margaret was not a secret eco-terrorist. She was something worse in the eyes of the law, reckless beyond measure. Her ignorance of the chlordine did not excuse the amazapa, which she had applied illegally, willfully, and with documented malice. The federal prosecutor offered her a plea deal, 2 counts of unlawful pesticide application, 1 count of interstate transport of a restricted chemical, 18 months in federal prison, and a fine of $250,000. She took it. Her sentencing hearing was sparsely attended. I was there, sitting in the back row. She wore an orange jumpsuit and looked at no one. The judge called her actions a cascade of arrogance that poisoned an entire community. She was led away in handcuffs. Her appeal was denied. The civil judgments came next. The HOA sued for groundwater remediation and won a judgment of $4.7 million, but Margaret's assets were gone. House was foreclosed, the Range Rover auctioned, her retirement accounts liquidated. Most of the families got pennies on the dollar. The state declared Ridgeline Estates a brownfield site, eligible for federal cleanup funds. The total cost of remediation hit 11.3 million. It took 18 months to restore the aquifer to safe levels. Families returned slowly, cautiously, their tap water tested weekly. Trust was not so easily remediated. For the church, the legal victory was total. The excommunication stood. Cardinal Rossini issued a final decree confirming that the penalty was justly applied and could only be lifted by the Holy See itself, should Margaret ever repent and seek reconciliation. As far as I know, she never has. The defamation lawsuit was dismissed with prejudice. The diocese used the insurance settlement from the parish policy to install a memorial garden where the vineyard had been. A black granite cross was erected at the head of the rows, inscribed with the words, "In memory of the vines that gave their fruit to God." But here is what you do not expect, what I did not expect, and what I still struggle to explain without my voice catching. 3 weeks after the memorial garden was dedicated, a package arrived at the rectory from Rome. It was a wooden crate, stamped with the seal of the Vatican Gardens, and inside were 60 dormant vine cuttings, each wrapped in damp burlap and labeled in Latin. A letter from Cardinal Rossini explained, in 1913, Father Francis had sent a box of rootstock to the Vatican's own gardener, a Franciscan brother who had studied viticulture in Bordeaux. The vines had been planted in a corner of the Vatican orchards, tended quietly for over a century, used occasionally for papal masses, but mostly just maintained as a living archive. The St. Michael's lineage had been preserved, unknown to anyone in Colorado. When Cardinal Rossini read the old correspondence during his research for the case, he immediately ordered cuttings to be returned. "What was lost," he wrote, "is not lost forever." Manuel and I planted those cuttings on Holy Saturday, April 15th, in soil that had been blessed and tested and declared clean. We dug each hole by hand, just as Father Francis had done. I am 72 years old. My knees ached for days afterward, but when I placed the first cutting into the earth, I felt something I had not felt since the morning I found the vines dying, hope, sharp and stubborn and refusing to die. The new vineyard is now 3 years old. The first small harvest came last autumn, a modest yield, just enough to press 1 barrel of sacramental wine. I celebrated Mass with it on the Feast of St. Michael, September 29th. The chalice trembled in my hands. Margaret Chenoweth was released from prison last April. She moved to Florida, I'm told. She never apologized, never reached out, never acknowledged the destruction she caused. But she also never imagined that the very act meant to destroy us would bring our community closer than ever before. The Ridgeline families now come to our harvest festivals. The HOA president, Arthur Pendleton, converted to Catholicism last Easter. And somewhere in the Vatican Gardens, a vine from 1911 still grows, bearing fruit that will never know Margaret's poison, because some things, truly sacred things, cannot be killed. They can only wait. I think about that often now. How some things, truly sacred things, cannot be killed. They can only wait. Margaret Chenoweth is 71 years old now, living in a condo outside Tampa. She will spend the rest of her life knowing that a century-old vineyard is growing again in the same soil she tried to sterilize, that her name is recorded in the Vatican archives, not as a hero of property rights, but as a cautionary tale, that a cardinal flew across an ocean to declare her separated from God, and the world watched. But here is what I want you to carry with you. This was never just a story about wine or religion or even an HOA dispute. It was a story about what happens when ordinary people decide that something small is worth defending. Arthur Pendleton could have stayed silent. The parishioners could have given up. The Vatican could have filed the report and forgotten it. Instead, at every turn, someone chose to act, not with vengeance, but with faith that doing the right thing still matters. Have you ever been in a fight like that? A neighbor who crossed the line, a zoning board that refused to listen, a bully who thought they could rewrite the rules because no one would stop them? Drop your story in the comments, because there is a whole community of people out here who need to know they are not alone. And if this story reminded you that even the smallest patch of ground is worth protecting, hit that subscribe button. I have more stories like this, stories about the little guy outsmarting the machine, stories with receipts. Next week, A city council tried to shut down a family farm that had been operating since 1893. They sent code enforcement 12 times in 6 months, so the farmer did something no one expected. He found a law from the 1870s that made his land untouchable. You will want to see what happened. Until then, remember, some things cannot be killed. They can only wait.